So the subject of this lecture are a few key issues in the final episode out of 3 episodes of All Washed Over by Machines of Love and Grace, a documentary by Adam Curtis. The final episode is episode 3, The Monkey in the Machine, and the Machine in the Monkey. So rather than summarize the content of this documentary or this final episode, I want to single out a couple of key issues that are important for thinking critically about digital culture. One aspect of this final episode is a critique of the idea of digital culture as simply being about information, overcoming material existence and all sitting behind desks and clicking and so on. The episode opens with an account of how Sony PlayStation 2 required minerals mined in Africa, and that many of these minerals were coming from a war zone. And so you have this major conflict between, in this case, what's not just a kind of digital device, communication device, but a simple piece of entertainment, if one can say so much, that is in high demand around Christmas time in Europe and North America, and the fact that some of the resources needed for its production are coming from not only the global south, but specifically from a war zone. So there's this question of how is it that you access these materials in a state of political crisis? That's the demand facing the production. And so you have a vision here of informatics that you could call materialist, right? You could even say it's related to something like political economy. That is the relationship of, politics and economics, and how it is that the economic needs of a society drive other political outcomes. In this case, something as simple as the Sony PlayStation 2, an entertainment console, finds itself caught up in global politics, global supply chains, the logistics of resourcing, and in particular, war zones. And this is a common topic for at least decades and probably centuries, that many high-tech products rely on minerals and other products extracted from regions that were either colonized or post-colonial regions, where the relationship between the industries gathering the goods and the state and the people is one that's highly inequitable, highly undemocratic, and does not redound to the benefits of all participants equally. One of the points that Adam Curtis seems to be trying to make is that this this event from the 2000s surrounding this PlayStation 2 and the Civil War actually relates to a longer history of colonialization, of control of the Congo by the Belgians, control of Zaire. And towards the end of the episode, Adam Curtis hits on a key point, something like informatic control. You could speak of the informatics of domination, in the sense that Belgian administration didn't simply control the territory and extract its resources. Of course, they did that. But it also introduced a new kind of myth of distinct races among the populations that was used to divide and conquer the territory, but was maintained through things like identity cards that established racially based identities. And that those identities, in a certain sense, were transmitted over a much longer period into the political life and into political conflicts, including 21st century Civil War. Now, when we look at something like these identity cards and their role in maintaining Belgian political power, clearly they belong to something like what Benneger has called the control revolution. That is the rise of governance based on information relayed and communicated at a distance, the collection of data, feedback on policy through that data. Part of this concerns the very basic fact of being in Brussels and controlling territory and populations in Africa, exploiting them. That is part of the control revolution that gives rise to cybernetics, control societies, systems of power shaped by information and relay. Another aspect of it, though, is the fact that control societies, the control revolution, operates according to personalization, according to targeting the population, identifying its specifics, or producing specific differences in the population, and exploiting them in a differential, tailored fashion to produce more effective production, more effective political control, and so on. So something like identity cards, developed to racially categorize the population, are not just a matter of bureaucratic records in a file. It's part of an informational strategy. It's a part about taking everyday physical relationships, interpersonal relationships, and turning them into fungible, calculable data, according to which the population can be manipulated, shaped, and so on. We've seen some of these ideas, not just in the context of the control revolution that Benneker talks about, but also what Gilles Deleuze calls the control society. The fact that the control society tends towards personalization, data, codes, flows of information and communication. But with the first episode of this, the final episode of this series, we start seeing that the history of the control revolution, the history of the control society is much more variegated than something like that short Deleuze essay would suggest. And it's certainly not just about the movement towards information flows that are more or less immaterial and tailored and, in a sense, enlightened, right? It also is also intimately linked to the rise of colonialism, post-colonialism, global exploitation, global supply chains, civil wars, and ultimately genocides, right? So this episode could be seen as a kind of critique of the myth of pure information, right? This episode is a critique of the notion that control, information, feedback is simply about people sitting behind computers and having better knowledge. Actually, the manufacture of those computers, the manufacture of networks, the processing of that data are deeply linked to global inequalities that are political in character, that are economic in character, and that are tied up with things like war, environmental devastation, and so on. Information is not pure. It's not clean. It has what you could call a kind of dirty semiotic underbelly, right? Information is deeply material, deeply cultural, and it's embedded in structures of power. This cannot, as much as we might want to talk about cybernetics and feedback and adaptation, you can never divorce information from these larger political, industrial, commercial infrastructures for its production, maintenance, and so on. Now, there are also ties of informatics to liberalism that are alluded towards in this episode, but are not completely unpacked. There are efforts we see in this episode to cultivate a kind of more liberal politics in Congo, or more democratic politics, that in Adam Curtis's reading actually lead to more violence, more dispute. And in this sense, the control revolution, the control society is ultimately about a governance based on more dynamic flows among people that move away from discipline, that move away from bodily violence, that move away from physical policing towards something like feedback and information. Obviously, democratic systems are a kind of feedback informational system of governance. Implementing control and flows and information is a messy affair. And it seems to me that the Curtis presentation is not entirely clear. It's a little ambiguous, but it seems to be laying a kind of emphasis on the idea that in the case of the Congo, this move towards a kind of more liberal, enlightened form of governance actually ends up producing greater violence. And we're supposed to make some links to that about what it means to live in a society of information machines. Also, there's a great emphasis in the film on a rational vision of human behavior, born of the Cold War, born of the 1950s, 1960s, where ostensibly we're going to free society from religious dogma, free it from blind moralism, and instead come up with an idea of humans as part of information systems, right? This seems like a kind of enlightened process. It seems rational. It leads towards a vision of humans as mindless agents of informatic DNA. So in the 1950s and the 1960s, the movement to understand social systems, social relations as systems, ultimately drew attention towards DNA, the way that populations reproduce across generations, and ended up with this kind of terrible vision of humans as, ultimately just being the material characters of some kind of informatic quality that is producing itself across humans. So this effort to have a more liberal, enlightened approach towards understanding human society, human relations, it's constructive shaping by informatics, seems to actually not lead to a liberal outcome, but an illiberal outcome. Not to a rational outcome, but an irrational outcome. And this is to some extent the emphasis of the whole series, but particularly this last episode. Liberal commitments to rational, non-coercive enlightenment are a major justification for the rise of control, information, cybernetics, and communications as a form of governments from the 50s onwards, certainly maybe from the 1940s onwards. This effort to establish a new kind of rationality leads to irrational outcomes, leads to violence, leads to economic collapse, leads to civil wars in Adam Curtis's analysis. There is also, in this final episode, a kind of critique of Western narratives of the digital. So some of the essays we read in this module, those by Deleuze, Terranova, Benninger, do lay a great emphasis on political, industrial, social developments in Western Europe and North America. And they tend to lay a little bit of emphasis on white-collar students, white-collar workers, students, artists, people who are part of the so-called cognitive class, right? There's two problems with this. Number one, the digital always operates on a global scale. Number two, that's a very small subset of the population whose lives are affected by digital media. Hence, we can think of what Donna Haraway called the informatics of domination. That is, that information and communication is always linked to global relationships. It's always related to global power. And generally, you can't really take the computer or IBM or the internet out of global relations of power and treat it an abstract entity on itself. Rather, it tends to be involved in racial politics, geopolitics, global supply chains that, for example, exploit non-liberal political systems for the benefit of ostensibly liberal political systems. A key example of this is Amazon's Mechanical Turk, MTurk, where part of the way it reaches, it realizes the kind of informatic dream of uh, uh, freely available labor at any time that can complete cognitive tasks and so on, is that it puts workers around the globe at the fingertips of people in London, in Birmingham, in Berlin, and so on. So this is to say, informatics itself tends when we talk about computing and digital culture, there is a tendency in some of the texts we've read to think about Western context, and that is a very partial approach to this story. Adam Curtis expands that story a bit in this episode. A few extra words are due about genetics and the control revolution. So Benninger lays great emphasis on the wide scope of the control revolution, on the idea that new ideas of control in informatics have their roots in industry, but penetrate into all of the sciences. So this is in his book on the control revolution. This is particularly true in the history of something like genetics. The 1950s discovery of DNA coincides to some extent with the post-war hype, post-World War II hype about computing, information theory, and cybernetics. So it's not entirely surprising that genetics and the examination of how it is that life is transmitted across generations is constructed in informatic terms. And to some extent, genetics imagines the building blocks of the cells as cybernetic machines. The expert on this is Lily Kay, the late Lily Kay, whose book, Who Wrote the Book of Life, explores, among other things, how it is that ideas from information and linguistics structure the 1950s and 1960s development of biology, molecular biology, and so on. This coincides with a broader tendency in the same periods, in the 60s, and then really intensifying in the 70s, to start thinking about economics, global economics, also as a kind of global information system. So the rise of neoliberalism, problems described by Philip Marowski in his books on cyborg economics, shows a very similar set of developments as those in molecular biology and genetics, which is that from the 1960s onwards, the global economy is understood increasingly as an information system where things like consumer behavior provide feedback, much as genetics and biology is understood as cybernetic machines organized by informational feedback, right? So when we're talking about the rise of digital culture, when we're talking about the rise of our society of control, we're not really just talking about people sitting before personal computers or clicking at their mobile phones. We're talking about a kind of intellectual hegemony, an intellectual influence is too strong a word, an intellectual prejudice that reconceives nearly all domains in informatic terms, cybernetic terms, communicative terms, so that even where you don't actually have a literal computer or machine present, you might very well have biologists who are saying, look at these cells, they act like digital machines, cybernetic machines. Adam Curtis, in this final episode, is really trying to point towards some of the broader terrains of these informatic ideas, of this idea of ubiquitous machines. And he's tracing it through some more peculiar avenues. A researcher gone to the jungles of Africa to pursue a conspiracy theory about the genetic origins of HIV. The history of informatics in the Congo as a kind of Belgian practice of political control. The other thing Curtis touches on, doesn't fully unpack, is that in fact, this idea of global information systems, this idea of a kind of rationality that is, in a certain sense, transcendent or metaphysical, it's pure rationale, it's purely mathematical, always has a kind of religious undercurrent, and even a kind of, not just religion, a particularly Christian undercurrent, right? So it's ultimately, if you look at the entire world as being informatic, if you look at the universe as being like a computer, sure, you can call that a scientific idea, but that scientific idea is also a religious idea. It's a set of ideas about not just what the universe is, but the kind of the spirit and order of the universe. If you don't want to call it religious, you could certainly call it cosmological, right? The notion that the cosmos, the universe, has a particular order underneath all things. And there's no way of delving deep into informatics or computing and saying that explains everything without ultimately running into a set of religious ideas. Because these ideas took root in Western Europe or North America, particularly the United States, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they often had a kind of Christian undercurrent, which Adam Curtis touches on in this last episode.